Thank you so much. Okay, I am going to ask Randy, who this is clearly not your first rodeo. And I lost count at 20, but I know that you hit an extraordinary number of states and really saw people getting ready for the election, had a real sense of like what was driving people's enthusiasm and animation around the midterms. So can you give us sort of an overview, but also talk a little bit about what you saw that was really different this year and where you think that points us in terms of how we take the gains that were made and really turn it into meaningful policies and meaningful change in people's lives?
So first off, I don't actually remember how many states and cities and counties I was in, but everywhere I went. So I pretty much, first off, I just want to say thank you to Michael, and thank you to Domingo, and thank you, Michelle, and thank you to all of you for being here. This is really the first Shanker, I guess, lunch we've had since this, since the election, not just since the election, but the first one that I've been to since I was basically on the road from Labor Day on. I do actually think that both Domingo and Michael are right, and I do think that it is the opportunity to actually do something meaningful right now. And so let me kind of start where Michael ended. I would actually say, though, that the changes that we've seen in this election, there has been a big teutonic shift of the plates right now as between now and 10 and 20 years ago. And I'm more where Domingo is in terms of what the stakes were right now. That I didn't find anything very benign in what has happened in the last decade or two. I think that there was a lot of cloaking of disinvestment by basically the shake it up policy. Shake teachers up, shake kids up, shake schools up, top-down accountability, disruption, privatization, all kind of as a guise for disinvestment. And you still have 25 states pretty much spending less on education than they did in 2008. And there was a sense that only the policymakers like the Deefers or the Gates Foundation or the Arnie Duncans of the world actually knew what they were talking about, not those who were, or the Michael Bloombergs of the world, or not the people who were actually the publicly elected school board members or the teachers or the parents. So you saw this sense of demeaning and disparaging and pitting students versus teachers or parents versus others. And I love bringing out these 3 time covers. Some of you have seen me do this before, but look, once a teacher, always a teacher. So remember, sorry, I'm not wearing my glasses, December 8th, 2008, right? Yep. 2008. Michelle Rhee, not just in Washington, D.C., but this cover of Time magazine basically sweeping out teachers. By the way, the teachers that she was basically sweeping out were, in Washington, D.C., were basically the kind of mid-age to in their 50s, 60s, 70s, predominantly African-American women who worked in Washington. Just like after Katrina, it was basically the African-American middle class that was swept out of New Orleans. But remember this one. Then in November 2014, there was the Silicon Valley takeover of schooling. Basically, if you got rid of due process, and this was, in some ways, sense that the due process systems basically made it well, the argument that Silicon Valley would make was that teaching was a job for life, that due process meant a job for life, that the evaluation systems were not working, and that there needed to be some shaking up of that. And that was getting rid of seniority and getting rid of due process and things like that. And then September 24th, 2018, this was one of 5 covers. So we've gone after the teacher strikes and after the kind of Parkland and other women's marches and other kind of protests for education, including some that Domingo just talked about in terms of what Ras Baraka did. You know, some of this was done as strikes, some of it was done electorally, like what happened in Newark. Now you have martyr teacher and teachers who are underpaid and don't have, and I love what Unite Here just said in terms of the Marriott strike, which is one job should be enough, but teachers selling their plasma to actually make ends meet. That, I think, is the difference in the culture. I think these three magazine covers give you a sense of the difference in the culture about education. That something, whether you agreed with Common Core or not, whether you agreed with charters or not, whether you agreed with accountability or not, that this all became too focused on too much control, far away from individual kids, individual parents, individual teachers, and not enough money to actually invest in the things that people believed were important to actually help kids learn. And so what you see walking into this election and in the spring and in the summer, and I actually think that even though she wasn't on the ballot, Betsy DeVos in some ways was on the ballot as kind of the standard bearer for that kind of sentiment. Was this sense, even though it may not have been the top issue everywhere, but there is 2 poll results I want to raise, was this sense that public education is important, and putting the public back in public education is really important, and actually having some sense of public education as foundational in communities is important. And that, I think, is the big difference. I do not think DeSantis actually ran on the issue of vouchers and charters, even though 2.5 minutes after he won, he is going to make that a huge issue in Florida. And I think you're going to see the same kind of huge fights in Florida as we just saw in Wisconsin, as we just saw in West Virginia and in Arizona and in Oklahoma and in Philadelphia and in Newark and in Chicago. But I think that DeSantis will take a page out of the book of the Scott Walker book. And I think he will try to go in that direction. But I think you're going to see a huge fight back there. And frankly, the Wall Street Journal, Mike, had its what a shock, had its facts wrong, because if you actually looked at the exit polling data, it wasn't 18% of DeSantis actually got 3% of the African American vote, not 18% of the African American vote. So it was interesting to see that the Wall Street Journal came up with what was really, really a flawed factual statement in trying to say that African Americans actually support school choice. African Americans support schools that actually work for their kids. And they will go anywhere, just like any other parent in the suburbs or elsewhere, for schools that will go for their kids. But what we've seen, whether it was basically everywhere in the country where the issue of education was litigated in a real way, public education won as opposed to lost, with one exception. The Colorado statewide initiative, it did not win, yet Gerard Polis ran on education, and you had in Douglas County and several other places, revenue measures actually were passed. In Wisconsin, there were 57, I think, revenue measures passed for public education. Douglas County, Colorado, revenue measures passed. All up and down Florida, revenue measures passed. And this is the other factoid that I really love. In the Economist and YouGov poll that happened right after the election, on the places of amongst the people who voted for Trump in 2016, where he was weakest in terms of poll ratings, budget deficits, health care, Medicare, Social Security, and education. So that these issues, this basket of, and this is where I get to, where I get to where Mike Petrilli ended. I think what we were hearing from the country was this battle of fear versus problem solving. It wasn't fear versus hope. It was basically fear versus problem solving. Keeping protection against or for people who have pre-existing conditions. That's problem solving. That, there wasn't the litigation, sorry to use that word, but there wasn't the litigation in this election of Medicare for all versus the ACA. It was, we need to have a basket of benefits to make sure that we have a better life. Gretchen Whitmer, fix the damn roads in Wisconsin, in Michigan. Tony Evers, as the former state superintendent of instruction, yes, we need to invest more in education. Kelly in Kansas, yes, we need to invest more in education. Michelle Lejean Grisham in New Mexico, yes, we need to invest more in education, early childhood education. It was a sense of what do we need to do to create opportunity and a better life for our kids, and at the same time have a check and balance on Donald Trump. That's what I think you heard and saw in this election. And for those of us afterwards, I think it is, to me, the election was a big relief. It wasn't a big victory. It was a big relief. It was a sprint to now run a marathon, because it is incumbent on those of us who are viewed as the winners in this election to do what Gretchen Whitmer said, get the damn roads fixed, get something done. And in some ways, the sense of, and this is the sense of, okay, let people have more voice in schools. Let their people have more voice in a democracy. Let there be some stability in school policy so that the disruptive influences are not what you're fighting against, but you're rolling up your sleeves and trying to actually do something in terms of investment, social emotional learning, engagement. This is actually our opportunity on a state level and on a national level, not to just have accountability against Betsy DeVos, but to actually try and get something done. IDEA funding, Title I funding, that investment funding that needs to happen around, that the promises that were made years ago that could actually help schools across the country, but also giving parents a voice, students a voice, teachers a voice, and having that investment in schools. There is a robust agenda that we can do and work on together to actually strengthen schools now that, at least for this moment, there is a consensus that public education is foundational in our communities. Thank you.